Thanks for listening to the Farmers Weekly podcast. Do remember you can subscribe to Farmers Weekly magazine and get all the latest news, views and market prices by visiting fwi.co.uk.
Giving us some time to plan for changes would be welcome. I don't think we're quite lemmings, but we are pushed to cliff edges an awful lot by government policy. Don't just drop it on us like they did the BPS cuts. Farming is a long-term business. We plan for multiple years, not just it's not like a business where you can produce widgets in 10 minutes. It's an annual 2-3 year cycle, crop rotation, livestock rotation. So we need notification if this is going to happen. Don't just drop it on us.
Just why did the government close its flagship agri-environment scheme without warning? We examined the options for farmers left out in the cold. A new report says the government must take food security and sustainable farming much more seriously. And is there really a future for lab-grown meat?
The Farmers Weekly podcast.
Welcome to the Farmers Weekly podcast. I'm Johann.
I'm Louise Impey.
And I'm Hugh. Broom.
We have lots to get through in this episode, and we'll kick off with the biggest story of the week, the closure of the Sustainable Farming Incentive with immediate effect. Thousands of farmers across England left unable to apply, and some of those already in the scheme facing an uncertain future too. First up, Northamptonshire farmer Andrew Pitts.
SFI fits our business really well. It helps de-risk us. We're in very turbulent times, both politically, financially, and with the weather as well. And by integrating SFI into our business, we're primarily a regenerative style of arable farming. It takes some of the risk out. It helps future-proof us as well. We've just had a huge cut in BPS. Our business lost £27,000, which we budgeted for, and £27,000 is a lot of money to lose without any advance warning. SFI is about the only kind of funding we can get from government. So it's a small risk management tool, and it's quite significant at the moment. So no, we have to find ways of making our business more resilient, finding premiums, maybe finding that from sort of private funding rather than public funding. But we need some warning. If this is coming, don't just drop it on us like they did the BPS cuts. Farming is a long-term business. We plan for multiple years, not just it's not like a business where you can produce widgets in 10 minutes. It's an annual 2-3 year cycle, crop rotation, livestock rotation. So we need notification if this is going to happen. Don't just drop it on us.
That's Northamptonshire farmer Andrew Pitts. Further west in Shropshire, more than 60 farmers belonging to the Cleeview Farmers Group are also in a quandary. James Turner.
We're just coming towards the end of a 3-year programme, and the SFI has been the main and most accessible way for everybody to be funded for farming in a more environmentally responsible way, whether it was hedgerows or soil health or biodiversity, habitat creation. It's all sort of pointed back to the SFI being the sort of bread and butter really of how to be rewarded for delivering that environmental benefit.
Some of the farmers in your group, yes, they weren't in SFI. Some of them were looking to apply. Some of them, including yourself, I believe, James, were going to be renewing SFI agreements. That option now very, very much in doubt.
The thing about the announcement is, on the face of it, it looks like it's closing and, most people have got an agreement. So therefore, what's there to complain about, really? That's the approach that's been taken. But actually, the interesting part of how it affects people is the sort of the nuance underneath that, really. If you just take our business, for example, we've got 3 mid-tier stewardship agreements running that are in the last couple of years of their term. We've also got an SFI 2023 agreement that's been going on for a year. But we were in the process of, so we were quite well covered, from the point of view of engaging in the schemes. We're quite a long way down the road compared to some. But we were in the process of putting together a 2024 agreement when the rug got pulled out from under us yesterday. And actually, the options that were in that 2024 agreement much better suited us in terms of the way we were farming. And they were much more lucrative from a payments point of view. But also, they were taking it up a notch. They were going to allow us to deliver more environmental benefit than what we were currently doing. So I think there's a whole raft of, from a handful of people in our group that don't have an agreement at all for one reason or another. And then there's a sort of whole raft of people that have been affected in different ways. because of other things such as, other changes in the system, things like inheritance tax planning, succession, the requirement of some of the SFI options to slightly change the way you're farming. So you sort of change your system first before you can apply to the SFI, then bring the option on board. So there's a huge impact to the whole group. Doesn't matter how sort of far on down the track they were with existing SFI agreements.
That's James Turner of Clearview Farmers. So with the sustainable farming incentive closed to new applications, just what should farmers do? Well, joining Louise, Hugh and myself on the line now from Oxfordshire is farm business consultant Jack Ball of Stratton Parker. Jack, what's the deal?
As disappointing as it is, there are still options out there. The thing I come back to is the top 25 in 2024. The top 25% of farmers show double the profits of the average business. So there's hope in good management and good people, good business administration to help drive the profitability of businesses. There is some alternative funding out there, perhaps not as comprehensive as we've been used to with the agri-environment schemes up to now. But water companies, we got used to water catchment funds and schemes, so they're still open. There's also a range of other funding. There's the farming and protected landscapes. Hopefully, we're going to get another farming productivity grant. So there are things there and things that may be able to drive profitability and yields as well. But it requires that investment in the first place, and it requires some security around if funding is actually going to happen.
Jack, with the SFI disappearing, and let's hope it doesn't disappear completely, but we don't know. But I always felt that it actually did put a standard in the market. You mentioned water companies, for example, and them paying for cover crops. Well, when we had the SFI actions, we knew what the payment rates were for those. Is there a risk now that farmers could end up receiving quite a lot less money from these private sources than they would have otherwise done?
There's certainly potential for that, and they'll come out in the wash. But water companies are driving value as well, and I expect they'll the values up to now have been pegged by SFI. There's no reason to suggest that they'll stay in the same place.
So, Jack, in terms of business planning and going forward here, I mean, obviously you mentioned the water company opportunity there, but that's pretty tiny. It's pretty specialist, and it's pretty restricted in terms of the areas where it's available. Any business planning at the moment would strip out any support, would it not? And then go back to basics and rebuild back on the basis that when the support does come, if it does come, you've got to look at it realistically as a bonus, haven't you? And drive for productivity.
I think that the days of, in the last 48 hours, the days of us banking on any form of support are probably over for any length of time. We're much more in the situation now where when the government or any other company or business sends a bus, you get on it. So that's definitely going to comprise part of our business planning. There's still a lot of people who don't do adequate financial planning. And even if they do, there's probably more they can do around increasing the profitability of their business, looking for different markets, really being critical about their inputs and production systems. I'm a big believer, farmers are there to produce food, but their overwhelming aim is to stay in business, and you've got to be a bit malleable to how you do that. And if that deviates slightly from producing food in its purest form, then that needs to be examined in the context of survival.
Yeah, and looking ahead, Jack, I mean, obviously, you're going to have a lot of farms that are in the SFI. I mean, I think Defra said there were 50,000 of them in there. But of course, they're going to start to need some different advice, aren't they, when their schemes come to an end, because they're very short term. And some of these farms will have taken quite a bit of land out of production. I know it's a while off yet, but any thoughts on that?
Indeed, and I think actually the more pertinent point is around the separation. There is already, with the options that the business we've entered into SFI so far, they've largely been arable businesses, and the ones that are losing out are grassland and grazing livestock and upland farms. So that's going to be the real challenge, is supporting those farms that have been to the SFI, because we were waiting for the cake tomorrow in terms of the options that were going to arrive this summer. So that's a real concern of mine. When we get to the end of the 3 years, some will be 2 years now, we'll just have to review what's happening at the time. And who knows what's going to happen in the next 2 years. Haven't quite got my head around what's happened in the last week.
Jack Bull from Farm Business Consultants, Stratton Parker, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us here on the Farmers Weekly podcast. Before Jack, we had James Turner from the Clee View Farmers Cluster Group, farming about 15,500 hectares of land in South Shropshire. And before James, we heard from Northamptonshire farmer Andrew Pitts. Louise, a glimmer of hope perhaps from Jack Bull, but it's clear from listening to James Turner, from listening to Andrew Pitts, that no matter how enterprising and adaptable and indeed optimistic you are as a farmer, you are going to be affected by the closure of applications to the Sustainable Farming Incentive Scheme.
Yeah, there's absolutely no way to sugarcoat that. There are going to be losers, and I think that's very sad when you consider how much work was put into encouraging farmers to enter this scheme. And at no point were we told it was a competitive scheme. So I think that needs to be emphasised. And the other thing which I've realised since we did our emergency podcast on Tuesday evening is that getting into the SFI was a 2-stage process. So you actually had to register your interest, and then after you'd done that, you would be invited to apply. So turning the taps off in the way that the government did, there was absolutely no need for that, because they would have known about how many people were interested and therefore the flow of new agreements likely to come through. So just to suddenly say, well, we've run out of money, I mean, I think that was a really terrible thing. But there you go. It's happened now. Yes, there are going to be losers, and there are going to be a lot of people sitting down and seeking the best possible advice that they can find, and to work out how they can, A, survive this immediate cash flow crisis period, and then B, how they can build their businesses on and develop and move on from here.
Some suggestion, Hugh, from Jack, that we know that a lot of the options in the SFI were favoured, I guess, lowland arable producers. Jack voicing concern that beef and sheep producers, lowland and upland, are going to be among those that are particularly hard hit by this decision.
Look, historically, as a beef producer, I can tell you, a lowland beef producer, historically, red meat production has always, grassland, lowland, upland, whatever grassland, has always been the poor partner of the agri-support cousin, as it were. It tends to get, all the money has tended historically always to flow onto the arable acres. And that's something that whenever we've been in discussions, or when I've been in, like, doing NFU groups and committee talks and stuff like, and you're talking about policy going forward, it's always been, we need to balance this off, because all of the cash is going into the arable acres, and it's never been because it's always income foregone, and it's always been run like that. So, you couldn't put, to be fair, the SFI was improving, because you could suddenly put wild bird on bits of where you could put you could put a margin on permanent pasture, whereas previously you could only put sort of margins and wild bird on what was previously deemed as arable land. So it was slowly improving. But yes, it was still massively skewed towards arable. And I think as we reflected on the emergency program on Tuesday, some of the real losers here, not just the lowland people, but I think the real losers, some of the upland people who've been waiting for these options, and these options started to materialise and then they've gone. But look, it's moving on time. It's, taking it on the nose, unfortunately. Where do we go to now? Will they get something out of the door, some semblance of a scheme this year? They're saying it's going to be sort of late spring, summer, after the spending review, where they know where they are. And what should the rule book look like, Johann? You forwarded me highlighted an excellent article on LinkedIn by Jeff Samsung, who used to work for Natural England, didn't he, for many years? And he highlighted some of the key issues and some of the things that he'd said before. And when we'd interviewed him on the podcast before, he had mentioned them. And it's things like having the limits in on some of these options. Some of the newer civil servants in Defra, not listening to some of the old guard, which are saying, you've got to limit the sweeties out the drawer here. You can't have unlimited spending on certain options because it's just going to fly out the door, which a lot of it has done, and you've ended up with whole farms that are wild bird option, 2,000 acres of wild bird or whatever it is. I mean, it's just crazy. Great for the person claiming it, but not very good for everyone else around them. There's no money left if they want to claim some as well. So it's just trying to build a system and a job that actually works and actually delivers, as opposed to, I suppose, what has just been a constant since Brexit. It has been a constant set of political knee-jerk reactions to either appease the farming lobby, appease the environmental lobby, appease the wider political lobby. And we've got ourselves to where we are. I'm not for a minute excusing what they've done, because it's not helpful. It's pretty horrendous and it's pretty unexpected. But equally, I don't know, the phoenix from the ashes. Can we think positively now and start to think what a decent system might look like and a fair and equitable system might look like? But then that relies on the government delivering it and not suddenly pulling the plug at the last minute with no notice at all.
Well, let's discuss that very point in just a moment, Hugh. But first, I really want to explore this article by Jeff Samson, the former head of agriculture at Natural England. Writing on LinkedIn, Jeff says the causes of this situation are more complicated and nuanced than they might first appear. They're about the legacy of past decisions, he says, multiple factors, not just a simple lack of cash. And the unintended consequences of all of this mean that farmers who are trying to do the right thing are now paying the price and losing out. And Jeff's saying that it's an announcement that has made him feel very sorry for Defra's own delivery bodies, who repeatedly advised Defra itself against many of the actions that they have taken, which has resulted in where we are now. So he's saying that these delivery bodies, the bodies that are delivering these schemes, brilliant, dedicated technical staff. Many of them, as you say, Hugh, have worked on the front line, advising farmers for years, building trusted relationships for decades, and now in the firing line for farmer angst as they roll down farm drives and being seen as part of the problem. And I think, again, it's the way that the government's handled this, because farmers were being told on the Rural Payments Agency website that they would have 6 weeks' notice of any scheme closure. So the closure with immediate effect of the sustainable farming incentive to new applications is an extreme breach of trust. And it wouldn't surprise me if a group of farmers got together, launched a class action, that the whole thing went legal. There was a legal challenge against the government for a breach of contract.
Yeah, I think the sentiment actually, it started off as outrage, but it's almost moved to despair now, because it's very, very, very difficult for them to know what to do next. And you mentioned the word legal, Johann, and I have to say the government has got some legally binding climate and biodiversity targets that it signed up to. So I'm just wondering how it is going to achieve those without the help, support and commitment of the farming community, because you would have thought that an awful lot of the work would have been done there. And the other thing, I think, to make the budget question has been asked repeatedly since Tuesday. How can they say the budget's all been used up? And it hasn't been very straightforward to get the figures and then to understand them, because, of course, the budget that they talk about actually spans 2 years rather than one. So when they say the budget's been all used up, you're not quite sure whether they mean this year's budget or both years' budgets or whatever. But I do think that with BPS going in such a dramatic fashion as it did, many people thought that there would be a bit more headroom and that money would be going into the sustainable way of farming that they were so keen for farmers to take up. So there's still quite a bit of misunderstanding out there. But as I said, there's actually really quite a lot of despair.
I can absolutely understand why there is despair in there. And interesting what you're saying about delivery of the Environment Act, the Net Zero Act, and all of these things have got to be delivered on. And the one thing, isn't it, if you want to change behaviour, if you want to encourage producers or the electorate or citizens of whatever sector, creed or whatever, you incentivise them, through tax or reward or subsidy or whatever, you incentivise them. Or you just sit there and hit them them with regulation. But you risk losing control as a government and, to a certain degree, regulator, if all you're left with is legislative tools, because no agency has the manpower to simultaneously prosecute and take action against thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are going totally mad, producing all they can. It's a hugely risky strategy. So I hope that out of this unsettling period, there is quickly some reassurance that something is coming, that it is coming in the sort of vague guise that we thought it might do, a reviewed, slimmed down, more focused thing, and take some of this despair away. Let's get a plan back on the table and start to see some action moving forward, because the performance of the last few days has not been good at all.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
As spring temperatures begin to rise, your thoughts will soon be turning to disease control in cereal crops. Many fields of wheat look full of potential, and prioritising a robust and reliable fungicide programme will offer protection from yield-robbing septoria and rusts. Univoc can be applied at the T1 or T2 timing and has proven, year after year, to give growers the best chance of enhancing yields and optimising the return on their investment. Find out more about Univoc, which contains Corteva's unique Inatrek active molecule, at corteva.co.uk/Inatrek.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
Now, a new report says the government must take food security and sustainable farming systems much more seriously. Published by the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, the report's author is Charlie Taverner, and we started by asking Charlie about his findings.
What we found is that it's been really difficult consistently over decades to make money from growing kind of good, healthy food. And that's not what's been valued in the economy of food. What's changed over that period of time is we've seen the emergence of kind of almost new industries in a way, ultra-processed food, much more eating out. We've also seen much more food being imported as the country become more reliant on imports. And that's seen the produce of what's been grown on British farms being devalued consistently over time. And that's led to this.
So you're saying that political leaders need to incentivise producers to be more sustainable, to change their practices on farm. Yet we've seen a whole chunk of that support put on ice this very week.
Feel it in there. There was real shock, wasn't there, at the announcement earlier in the week about SFI, though, given there's been lots of mutterings about the future of Defra's budget, maybe we should have seen it coming in some ways. I think what we need to do, if we realise that state support for agriculture, whether that's direct payments or agri-environment schemes, if that money is going to be shrinking, what's going to fill that void? Is government going to step in and start saying, okay, we're not going to pay for it. How can we mobilise the private sector to be supporting a lot of those those public goods that the agri-environment schemes are supporting? So it's going to be really interesting to see how this kind of reset and sustainable farming incentive kind of rolls out later in the year. Because there's going to be enormous kind of impact on tens of thousands of rural businesses of this change. And I think it speaks to a bigger question too, is that if we're really going to drive change and make healthy food available to everyone, affordable to everyone, and also be growing that food in a much more sustainable way that kind of improves our impact on the environment, then we've got to take action right across government. And Defra has a set of powers that it can do, and farming policy we all get into the weeds about, and it is really important, really interesting. But a lot of the policy levers that need to be pulled to really drive change sit in the hands of other big departments, international trade, the Treasury, even housing and communities, things about kind of planning along those lines. So we've got to have a much broader, bigger conversation about what we want our economy of food to look like, and much more concerted, joined-up action across government to drive real change.
So, Charlie, you seem to be saying food security is important, not just because of climate change, but also because of the geopolitical situation and everything that's going on in Ukraine.
Absolutely. We're just being bombarded by kind of terrifying headlines at the moment, aren't we? Whether it's war in Ukraine, whether it's President Trump's threat of tariffs on and the way that will disrupt kind of international trade. There's all sorts of shocks on the horizon. And food systems experts who spend a lot of time thinking about these questions are talking much more about resilience And farm businesses are thinking much more about resilience too, economic resilience, environmental resilience. And really what we're talking about there is the ability to withstand these kinds of shocks and kind of react and build back better in a much more kind of positive and fair way. The trouble is, resilience requires lots of different things. One of those things is the capacity, human resources, natural resources to be able to kind of cope with challenges. And they've been eroded because it's been so hard kind of financially for farms and also kind of personally for farmers. And the other thing that resilience requires is diversity. We need a really kind of diverse, decentralized food system that isn't just reliant on a smaller number of farms, that isn't just reliant on a shrinking number of very, very large kind of big food and big agriculture kind of businesses dominating these links in the food chain. Because there's a real risk that if you see a disruption to one of those links in that system, you can have kind of major kind of cascading effects because we're so reliant on those kind of smaller number of bigger firms. That's the real challenge. That's what we've got to be aware of that's happening. That's the context.
That's Charlie Taverner there, author of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission report called Paying the Price, Cheap Food, Big Business and the Cost of Farming and Food Security. And we'll put a link to that report on the show notes page of this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. So, Louise, Charlie Taverner saying food security, the government just has to take it more seriously.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that's gone into this report. And I have to say, I think we all know that there's a problem with the food system. I mean, we've heard Henry Dimbleby speak about this at length. So when you scan this report, really, you're looking for solutions because it points out the things, it's failing farmers, it's failing consumers, and it's failing the environment. And they do come up with some recommendations and, we can talk about those in a moment. But one of the things that really did strike me in the report, and again, it's not a new bit of information, but it does point out that farm incomes have barely improved since the 1970s. So it does highlight how disadvantaged the farming sector is. And as we all know, that's just got a bit worse this week.
Hugh, Louise makes a really good point there that over the last 40 or 50 years, consumers really have benefited from cheaper and cheaper food prices. But farmers over that same sort of time frame have really struggled to make a living, struggled to be profitable. And often the only way that they can do so is by getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, and it's support that's balanced that off, isn't it? Farm support over the decades is what's balanced that off. It's incentivised farmers to go down whichever route, be it an environmental or a production-led route. But ultimately, it's the support that subsidised the lower farm gate or the not keeping up with inflation farm gate prices. The figures, 40-odd% of household incomes spent on food in the late 1960s, compared now it's between 8 and 11%. Even take into account crazy inflation spikes like we had around Ukraine and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's deciding. I mean, this report, the one thing that strikes me is it talks about getting more money back into farmers' pockets, more, making farming, I suppose, more pleasurable again and less spiky and less seat your pants, zero margin, borrow loads of money. But to do that, you've got to get more money in. So you've either got to subsidise more back into farmers and say, look, there's a subsidy. You can go a bit steadier now. You've got to worry too much. It's back to being, getting the IX payment and so on and so forth. Or people have got to pay more for food. And that means inflation goes up. Well, government's not going to like that, are they? So it's pretty simple.
All the way through this report, there is this thread about the risk to food security and the importance of resilience in a world that's seeing not just the effects of climate change, but also unstable geopolitics. It all makes it, Louise, so important that we do take food security seriously. In a week when the government has cut the sustainable farming incentive, or at least closed it to applications, that was one way that farmers were being encouraged to produce food more sustainably. So the report itself, extremely timely.
It is very timely and very topical. I'm a bit like you and Hugh. The solutions that we need, it's a tricky one, isn't it? At the end of the day, there are only two ways to get more money into the food system and get the money going to the right place. you either charge more for the food in the shops or you pay for it through your taxes. And I'm not sure if either of those are very palatable at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of reception or wider reception this report gets and whether we see any actions coming out of it.
One action that will be, I'm sure, appealing to farmers is setting core standards in trade deals. That's one of the recommendations of the report around the environment, and also health, animal health and animal welfare, that ensuring that those are tied to UK farming policy. So we're not undercutting our own farming sector by importing food that is produced using methods that would be illegal in the UK.
Yeah, and that's really, really important to have that strict, I suppose, trade framework and equivalence in terms of standards and all that sort of stuff. Just going back to when you're talking about resilience and talking about resilience in the supply chain, actually, the one bit of the food supply chain that is, I would say, pretty blooming resilient are the farmers. If you think about those farm businesses, yes, they've changed, they've morphed, they've got bigger. None really have got smaller. They've generally just amalgamated, and we've seen consolidation. But those businesses historically have been pretty resilient. The very fact that as a primary sector, it's what stands farming, fishing and forestry apart globally. It is the one primary sector where you still have lots of individual private ownership. Not that this government might like that, I don't know, judging by their tax policy. But if you look at other primary sectors like steel and ores, mining, oil, they're multinational for a reason, because the margin was so thin. The only way that you effectively advance is you just keep a conglomerate. You can keep amalgamating and you keep getting bigger. But farming is so it has a degree of resilience by the very nature of those private business ownerships. And it could be that the vulnerability, you could argue, is in the processing part and the retailing part, where you've got smaller numbers of players doing big, huge jobs. Now, they're hugely efficient, but you could argue there's a vulnerability there. But then the flip side of that, make it less vulnerable. Oh, let's have a promotion of lots of small things going on and lots of local things. It's hugely expensive. Who's going to pay for it? So there's no quick fix here, and we know the answers. We just got to get on with it.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
Discover Kubota's M7004 series, which celebrates a decade of exceptional innovation in Kubota's flagship tractor lineup. The new M7004 features a 6.1-litre, 4-cylinder Kubota engine with up to 175 horsepower and offers a choice of power shift or updated KVT transmission. It is equipped with advanced auto guidance, smart farming technologies and TIM, Kubota's tractor implement management for semi-autonomous operations. Key updates enhance operator convenience, including the ability to set cruise control speed without moving, an automatic assisted parking brake, and an improved K-monitor for expanded functionality. For more information about the new M7004 series, visit www.kubota.co.uk or contact your local Kubota dealer today.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly Podcast. Welcome along wherever you're listening to us from. You can email us, podcast@fwi.co.uk. You can also, if you're in the UK itself, message us by texting the word farm, followed by your message to 88440. Hugh, messages this week?
I've had no messages other than lots of comments about the SFI thing, but no specific messages, no, other than everyone's loving the podcast.
Louise, how about you? How's the Louise Impey fan club doing? You've always got some messages for us here on the Farmers Weekly Podcast.
I certainly have. But no prizes for guessing what they were about. So, this week has been a busy week for talking to people. It's been long hours as well, hasn't it, for all of us? So, but it's the one subject that is really occupying everybody's minds at the moment. And, we have now started to see the wildlife organisations and environmental groups coming out equally aghast, actually. So, they didn't seem to know anything about it either.
I still can't get my head around, Johann, Louise. I still can't get my head why this was all done at the last minute, because we were just talking offline just then, Louise, you mentioned, and I'd remembered when I filled in my SFI the other year, it's a two-stage process. You express an interest, and then once that's all logged, you're then invited to apply, and that could be a matter of hours or it could be a matter of weeks. So it's worked. So this idea that if they didn't get the announcement out at 6:00 on a Tuesday night with half an hour's notice to the press, that the RPA master computer would explode and melt down half of Caversham or whatever it is just bonkers, because you could just have filtered it out. And would it have not been a more sedate way to just roll the news out in an orderly fashion the following morning? Or was the Secretary of State having to dash off somewhere and he needed to get this out quickly? I don't know. It's just still stress. Or is it some evil master plan from the Cabinet Office and Number 10? Let's just keep turning it in on the farmers. I don't know. It's just still slightly bonkers, isn't it?
I think they need to stop turning it in on the farmers, as you say, because this could get really, really messy and really nasty, because they're pushing the farming community into a very, very tight corner, and there's going to be some sort of reaction, I'm sure, before too long.
Also in the news this week, Hugh, Tesco's to begin a trial giving food away to customers for free at the end of the day as it tries to cut food waste. Anything that's got an already discounted yellow sticker item on it after 9:30 in the evening will be given away free in some smaller express stores.
It's a tricky line, that, isn't it? Because on one hand, they're trying to stop people walking out the store with stuff that they haven't paid for. So that's a massive issue across all of retail at the moment, at whatever level, wherever you are. Anyone listening, runs a farm shop, listening to this will be going, yeah, you're not wrong. So that's happening. I absolutely get that if you can get someone to walk out of the store with an item of 500 grams of something for free, it's cheaper than giving it to someone like Defra to put in an AD plant or landfill, because that is cost to the business. But do you not think it blurs the line a bit between what's to pay for and what's not? I don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Everyone might stop going shopping for the whole of the day and wait for all the yellow stickers to go on, and then they all charge in at 9:31. How's it going to work?
Tesco says expiring food will be offered to charities and shop workers first before customers can take it. So there you go. Free food at Tesco.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? On the podcast issue where we've been talking about the broken food system, here is, a supermarket obviously trying to cut waste, and food waste we know is a big problem. But here they are giving away food that has cost somebody quite a lot to produce in the first place. All I hope, obviously, is that the cost of doing that comes down on the retailer and is never passed back down the supply chain at all.
Yeah, fair supply chain, good for everyone, especially in farming, as are fair commodity prices. Hugh, this week's markets, what's happening?
Thank you very much, Johann. Finished steer deadweight this week, 655.4, up from 642.2. So I think that's another record this week. The steer live weight, 364.5. That's up 5p on the week. For the lambs, deadweight SQQ this week, 738.9. That is up 0.9 of a penny on the week. The live weight SQQ also goes up 6p, 350.9. Pigs SPP average 203.8. That is up marginally from 203.28 last week. To the arable markets, and it dropped hugely last week, but it seems to have just slowed up a little bit. In fact, it's gained marginally. Feeder wheat up a couple of quid, £170 and 10p, up from 168.60 last week. Milling wheat 190.9. That is up just over £1. Feed barley almost stands still. It drops by 10p. £153.60 for a tonne of feed barley. Oilseed rate 396.5 onto, that's dropped quite a bit actually from £414 last week, so some movement there. Feed peas 214.7, that's up £1. Feed beans 215.1, that is also up £1. And good news if you're filling up the tractor with diesel, 68.66 is the average price of a litre of red diesel this week. That has dropped down from last week when it was 72.68.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
And finally, meat grown in a laboratory could be on sale in the UK for human consumption within 2 years. That's because the Food Standards Agency is looking at ways to speed up the approval process for lab-grown foods. But will anybody eat it? Well, here's Julia Melentine, Director of New Nutrition Business, one of the world's few international specialists in the business of food, nutrition and health.
The thing about lab-grown meat is it's an area which has been subject to massive hype by scientists hoping to turn themselves from humble scientists into billionaires, and from billionaire investors who think they're going to make the next billion. And that's really been what's driving it for the past 10 years. And we know about this because we have customers in the world of investment. We have customers who have invested in lab meat. We have a customer who even makes the stuff. And so we have a really clear inside view about how it started and how it's got to where it is today. The finance people, they just see the dollar signs. So all it needs is some young guy to turn up with a PowerPoint presentation saying, we're going to fix the broken food system. Livestock farming is a hazard to the environment and all this nonsense. And they just think, oh, great, okay, that's how I'm going to print my next billion. So that's why they put so much money behind it. Lab meat is on track to be one of the biggest failures. No, it's on track to be the biggest failure in the whole of food industry history. In the past year and a half, lots of lab meat companies have folded. They're going to go on folding. And the reasons they're folding are, one, the technology is not as easy to commercialize as the people behind it claim. Two, when you do create a product, while it is possible to create something that might taste and look a bit like, say, beef, if you actually ask these companies, and we have done this, show me a spec that has on the one side the nutrients that you find in your lab meat, and on the other side, all the nutrients you find in an equivalent piece of beef, they cannot do it. None of them wants to look at that because they're producing something which is, at the end of the day, ultra-processed and nutrient deficient. And because of the costs of production, it's not like a farm. You have to have a pharmaceutical standard production facility. Some of your readers will know what I mean by a Class 10,000 facility. If you've ever worked in one of those, it is as far away from food production as you can get because the risks of contamination in fermentation are very high. So you end up with a very expensive product.
So a big financial challenge then, Julian, but also consumer acceptance. That's going to be a challenge too. It just doesn't sound right or even look right, lab-grown meat.
Well, that's a very good point. And it's not just a question of the appearance because, one day someone will manage to jig the tech around so it can produce something that looks okay. It's the psychology. And as is often the case when scientists get knee-deep into food, they forget that food is an important part of culture. So meat, for example, in most cultures plays a role in family eating occasions, traditional recipes, all the sort of normal rituals that families have. And you do not throw that away quickly, especially if you're offering to replace it with a product that's more expensive. People have a certain level of disgust at something that comes from a factory. And the reality is, if you look back at the food industry of the past 25 years, almost everything which is overtly tech fails. If you say to people, here's a piece of technology, we'd like you to eat it, they reject it. People will drive technology, they'll phone technology, they'll get technology from a pharmaceutical drug to fix a problem, but they don't eat technology. And that's why, if you look at the big successes over the past 25 years, they're just about taking traditional things and making them more available to people. So, Greek yogurt, for example, kefir, skyr, all those sorts of things, they're not tech, and they are massively more successful. All the simple dairy proteins, cottage cheese, quark, all those things, if you add up the sales growth they've had in recent years, they are massively more successful There's no way that lab meat can be said to even approximate them, because that's what consumers want. They want something that's natural, traditional, that connects to their beliefs about how food is made. They want real, they want simple, and lab meat totally failed in all of those things. You've probably seen, there's a lot more discussion in the media about ultra-processed foods. Well, guess what lab meat is? So it's as if some people decided to create a product and ignore every single thing that is known about consumers and food. I mean, it's just such a piece of breathtaking ignorance. It's hard to believe it's real.
Julian Melentine from New Nutrition Business, strategic advice for the food and beverage industry. Hugh, lab-grown meat, they say it's the future, but not for Julian.
Well, yeah, it's pretty damning stuff. It's of no great surprise what he says. I mean, when we've had Julian on the podcast, we're amazingly knowledgeable. And I think, the fact that all this money has been ploughed into this with no real thought to the outcome sort of shows, it is a bit scuppered. And I think the big difference here, because we sort of had a similar conversation around a lot of the plant-based stuff 3 or 4 years ago. And the massive difference here is on the plant-based stuff, the food companies suddenly went, oh, there's this environmental thing going on, this plant. Quick, how do we make plant-based stuff, Fred? Well, you just go and buy a load of soy and a load of mushroom derivative and then chuck flavours in and call it bacon. And you can add like 50% margin to a load of cheap soya, which is what they've done. Now, to actually get it to market will cost money, and it has, you've got to market it, promote it, develop the product. But the amount of money they've risked on that compared to what they've risked on this lab-grown meat thing, it's tiny. The lab-grown meat thing, from what Julian's saying, is utterly huge. The hundreds of millions, the billions that have been thrown at this. And at the moment, it doesn't seem to be moving anywhere, despite these sort of relaunches and obviously the FSA saying they're going to license it within the next 2 years. People aren't buying into it. It's a tricky old market.
Louise, Julian raised a really interesting point about stuff that is grown in labs, sort of saying that we don't eat tech. That really sort of resonated with me. I just find lab-grown meat, it's just a bit of a weird concept, isn't it?
It is a weird concept. And I was remembering back to the podcast that we did. It was actually before Christmas time when we did that item on Bovea and the consumer backlash to that. And we had Amy Jackson on giving us some insight into that. And she described this concept known as the yuck factor. And that's when the consumer just thinks, I don't know what's going on here. And as a result, it's just not something that I want to eat. And at the time, she made the point that both dairy and meat actually are whole foods and very natural. And then as soon as you start messing about with them, that's when the consumer switches off. So, as you say, eating technology? No. I think we're happy to wear technology. We're happy to drive technology. But no, at the moment, the psychology is going to really come in here. And I think the consumer's just not going to go down that route.
Full of scepticism then here on the Farmers Weekly podcast when it comes to lab-grown meat. That's about it for this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. I think I'm going to go off and cook myself a steak or something like that towards the end of what has been a very, very busy week for UK agriculture. Do remember to subscribe to the Farmers Weekly podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like what you hear, please do leave us a 5-star review. We're going to try something else this week. If you'd like to leave us a message, we usually say email us at podcast@fwi.co.uk. You can also, if you're in the UK, message us by texting the word farm followed by your message to 88440. Going to try something else. If you want to send us a voice message, get something off your chest, tell us why the government's wrong when it comes to inheritance tax or indeed the sustainable farming incentive, record us a voice note on WhatsApp and then send it to us at 07967634971. That number again, 07967634971. And if we get any of those WhatsApp voice messages from you, we'll pick one or two and we'll play them on next week's episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. Until next week then, I'm Johann.
I'm Louise Impey.
And I'm Hugh Broom.
Thank you for listening.